We're on chapter 17 called Miss Honey's Story. Chapter 16 saw Miss Honey and Matilda inside her cottage and the revelation of the condition in which Miss Honey actually lives. And from being fun, it has come to Matilda's attention that this is probably not a choice that she makes, that Miss Honey has in terms of the conditions of her house and the amenities which she doesn't have, and really a very frugal lifestyle, if somewhat sad. However, this chapter continues to develop the dynamic between Miss Honey and Matilda, where initially Matilda, maybe in the previous chapter, was the little girl being able to open up to an adult for guidance, and in this chapter there's a slight reversal of that role, where it is Miss Honey who opens up to Matilda, which is an evolution again of their relationship as they grow closer together. Matilda, as we know, is a perceptive young girl. She's small, but she clearly understands that there's something wrong with Miss Honey's setup. And she's also curious, and she's gentle and sensitive about the way that she tries to draw out Miss Honey to understand what's happening. So she asks about teachers' income and whether all teachers live in these conditions. And Miss Honey just explains that I just happen to be the exception. So everybody else lives much better than her, is the kind of confession Miss Honey gives. Now, Matilda is weighing between wanting to find out what's happening and trying not to be too intrusive. So she speaks about Miss Honey choosing to live simply and not being burdened by taking so many groceries, having to save time on shopping, and also not having to dust and all of this. But it says that she probes a little further. So probing means slowly digging into what she's trying to find out about Miss Honey. And finally, Miss Honey, initially very, very stiff, kind of melts and relinquishes that she's quite happy that Matilda is there, and she's the first guest that Miss Honey ever brought to her house, probably because Miss Honey wanted to talk to her about it and share her story with her. Let's look at this passage now from the book, where Miss Honey describes how she feels about Matilda in terms of her maturity. "You're so much wiser than your years, my dear," Miss Honey went on, "that it quite staggers me. Although you look like a child, you are not really a child at all, because your mind and your powers of reasoning seem to be fully grown up. So I suppose we might call you a grown-up child, if you see what I mean." Matilda did not say anything. She was waiting for what was coming next. "Up to now," Miss Honey went on, "I have found it impossible to talk to anyone about my problems. I couldn't face the embarrassment. And anyway, I lack the courage. Any courage I had was knocked out of me when I was young. But now, all of a sudden, I have a sort of desperate wish to tell everything to somebody. I know you are only a tiny little girl, but there is some kind of magic in you somewhere. I've seen it with my own eyes." This passage describes so aptly how Miss Honey feels about Matilda, and picks up on the fact that Matilda's so sensitive and careful about how she's putting forward the questions. Matilda, yes, is curious, and Miss Honey recognizes that, but also she sees her as more than a child, far more than a little girl, and in such this allows their relationship to reach this other level where Miss Honey sees her as someone who she can trust and open up to, which she clearly so desperately needs. The bond between Miss Honey and Matilda continues to evolve. This brings back to the theme of adults, children, and power. There's a constant shift in this, and also how sometimes one party, like now the child, is elevated, and sometimes the adult often usually takes the upper hand. But in this case, there's this continuing synergy where they're helping each other basically develop almost. Miss Honey, very much like Matilda, had a rather unhappy childhood. Her growing up was fraught with instability, and actually far more than instability, it was actually quite tragic, as she describes losing her mother and then having an aunt who was despicable come into her house and to look after her, as her father was a doctor, and that was not a caring relationship in the least. On top of that, we learned that the aunt was very deceitful, and so this shows again an adult using their power in order to push down a child, which in this case was Miss Honey, but then in front of her father, Mr. Honey would pretend she was something else. So there's an interplay between appearance and reality, and how she uses, the aunt would use that to manipulate the situation. After the death of the father, the aunt's ulterior motives seem to come to the front. She was actually after the father's home, and which was quite a valuable bit of real estate. The desire here is one for power. So the aunt clearly wants to overpower in terms of finances, but also having control over other people. There's two passages I'd like to look at from the book over here, which highlights the effect that this had on Miss Honey. So the first is, I think what I'm trying to explain to you, she said, is that over the years, I became so completely cowed and dominated by this monster of an aunt that when she gave me an order, no matter what it was, I obeyed it instantly. That can happen, you know. And by the time I was 10, I had become her slave. I did all the housework. I made her bed. I washed and ironed for her. I did all the cooking. I learned how to do everything. But surely you could have complained to somebody, Matilda said. To whom? Mrs. Honey said. And anyway, I was far too terrified to complain. I told you, I was her slave. Miss Honey explains that through all of this, she was also a very bright girl, and so decided to go and get trained as a teacher in a not so far away town, although she wasn't allowed to go to university. And this is another link between Matilda and her. They're obviously both very intelligent people, though Matilda of another level, of course. I'm going to read the next passage. So you could have just packed up and walked away, Matilda said. Not until I got a job, Miss Honey said, and don't forget, I was by then dominated by my aunt. To such an extent that I wouldn't have dared. You can't imagine what it's like to be completely controlled like that by a very strong personality. It turns you to jelly. So that's it. That's the sad story of my life. Now, I've talked enough. The description that Miss Honey gives of her childhood and what she went through with her aunt are actually quite painful. It is difficult to try and imagine a child having gone through such hardship, and also you understand why she explains that she was cowed and dominated by this person. And obviously, this raises the question of how important it is to call out injustices and doing something about them, because that destroys a person in the long term. Um, of course, it's very difficult to try and understand what Miss Honey could have done, and this is where Matilda is quite she's baffled, she's confused about how Miss Honey was able to stay for that, but she was in fact very much on her own. And as a small child with no relations, and in the care of her aunt, who was very, very abusive, you cannot really imagine to what extent Miss Honey could have done something to change her circumstances. There's also the build-up of this aunt and our understanding of another woman, who torments and overpowers children for her own contentment, it seems, to gain power and pleasure. So there's once again this theme of adults, children, and power, and how they interplay with each other. You also have how life with her aunt is one of absolute neglect and actually abuse, which is different to what Matilda had gone through, in that, yes, she was brushed away and treated badly by her parents, but there is an insinuation that Miss Honey was even victim of potentially physical abuse, and of course that escalates the situation furthermore. And so Miss Honey, as a result, was terrified into obedience, and this puts it in contrast to Matilda, which the writer is obviously trying to say that Matilda's attitude towards injustice is what he proposes is the best option, which is that she was able to act in her defense, even through silly pranks and so on and so forth, but to punish the evil that the adults did in whatever way she could. Whereas Miss Honey chose to do nothing. You also remember that Matilda took matters into her hand and went to the library and so on, and this is what she wanted to do in order to find her sanity, whereas Miss Honey didn't. Again, we don't know the circumstances in which Miss Honey was. Maybe she was too controlled, and so we do know, though, that doing nothing is not something that the author is supportive of. We at this point are trying to understand that this character, this aunt, also uses various tactics in order to gain power, which includes manipulation. And potentially, we recall that there might be instances where Miss Honey as a child might not have been believed by other adults, which brings us again to the question of how children need to be dealt with by adults in order to keep a dialogue and allowed to express themselves and to be taken seriously. Miss Honey has tried to wrap up the story of her life, the sad story of her life, as she says, and but Matilda feels that there's more to go, so she encourages her to keep speaking. And one of the things that she wants to know, as a curious little girl, is how she ended up in this little cottage, and, or as she calls it, this funny little house. This also sparks something in Miss Honey, who says, "I was proud of that." And this brings us back to the fact that she is somebody who, although is cowed, has also chosen to continue to educate herself, which is something that the author is pushing as something very, very positive and something that everybody must do. And also the fact that she was proud of how she got out of that situation, meaning that she, with the help of this teaching job, to some extent, she was able to break away from her dependent situation with her aunt. And even though this was the solution, it was still a better solution than living underneath her roof. Miss Honey explains what happens. Well, Miss Honey said, when I got my teacher's job, the aunt told me I owed her a lot of money. I asked her why. She said, because I've been feeding you all these years and buying your shoes and your clothes. She told me it added up to thousands, and I had to pay her back by giving her my salary for the next 10 years. I'll give you £1 a week pocket money, she said. That's all you're going to get. She even arranged with the school authorities to have my salary paid directly into her own bank. She made me sign the paper. You shouldn't have done that, Matilda said. Your salary was your chance of freedom. I know, Miss Honey said, but by then I had been a slave nearly all my life, and I hadn't the courage or the guts to say no. I was still petrified of her. She could still hurt me badly. Miss Honey's description of having been forced to sign paperwork which signed over her checks directly to her aunt's bank makes you understand how dominant this aunt was over her, and also potentially how powerful she is in society. There's obviously, this explains how Miss Honey ended up in the situation that she's in, how she lives in such poverty on a farm laborer's tiny cottage, and also relying on, for example, the lunch served at school to be able to satisfy her and get enough to eat. Matilda, on the other hand, shows her understanding of what Miss Honey has done by signing over her salary to her aunt. She immediately realizes that this is a massive mistake and that the salaries were Miss Honey's only chance of gaining some power and having control over her own life. Now, Miss Honey is clearly left to operate under her aunt's thumb still. She may have moved out of the house where her aunt lives. However, she is still not a fully independent adult as a result of not having the income to support her. So this passage is extremely important because it also comes from Matilda. And Matilda is the one who says you shouldn't have done that. Your salary was your chance of freedom. And that, in a nutshell, is what the novel is very much pushing in terms of the ideal situation for an adult woman who is an adult. An adult woman will be most secure when they work honestly for their salary and for their money and have control over it. Now, Miss Honey is, as we said, still living almost as a child. We see the cottage now as almost like a playhouse where she's like in a large dollhouse. She's independent, but really she's not really living. She's not thriving. She's surviving under the auspices of her aunt. Now she is stuck and she has no way of getting out of this situation without the financial freedom that she needs. And she's so petrified and she's been so abused that she cannot advocate for herself or turn to people to support her. Finally, this is also a very important sign that once someone has been in an abusive or bad home life, it is very, very difficult for years after to free yourself from that. And Miss Honey is the example that the author uses to illustrate this point. Miss Honey explains how she finds the cottage on one of her walks and manages to convince a rather shocked farmer that anyone would want to rent the place, but he rents it to her for a pittance for 10 pence a week. And she's thrilled at just being able to get access to this little bit of independence. And when Miss Honey returns home and tells her aunt is horrified that this has happened, because by giving her only £1, she is restricting her movement and keeping the rest of her salary. And yet Miss Honey managed to get herself out of the house by settling for this tiny house and by making do. And that absolutely infuriates the aunt, and she rushes off. And this is what Miss Honey tells us. "I was free at last," Miss Honey said. "I can't tell you how wonderful it was." "But have you really managed to live here on £1 a week for 2 years?" Matilda asked. "I most certainly have," Miss Honey said. "I pay 10 pence rent, and the rest just about buys me paraffin for my stove and for my lamp, and a little milk and tea and bread and margarine. That's all I need, really. As I told you, I have a jolly good tuck-in at the school lunch." Matilda stared at her. What a marvellously brave thing Miss Honey had done. Suddenly, she was a heroine in Matilda's eyes. Miss Honey has been extremely bold in doing what she has done to get herself a little bit of independence by living in this tiny cottage with the smallest of perks. And like the stories from Hortensia of bravery, when she described the pranks that she pulled on Miss Trunchbull, we have Matilda looking at Miss Honey with complete admiration, because this brings back the notion that Miss Honey did make a move in order to fight the injustices that she was facing. And that creates admiration in Matilda, very much as Lavender and Matilda had been awestruck by Hortensia when she was seen as punishing Miss Trunchbull in the school through her antics. Now, Matilda goes through another moment of understanding, where she sees that Miss Honey does not have a bed to sleep in. And Miss Honey responds in a very gentle way that it is considered as healthy to sleep on a sturdy surface. But of course, she's not sleeping on a bed because she cannot afford a bed. And at that moment, Matilda just sees it all. And in the book, it's described, all at once, Matilda was able to see the whole situation with absolute clarity. Miss Honey needed help. There was no way she could go on existing like this. indefinitely. Matilda's proposition for Miss Honey to leave school and collect unemployment benefits is, of course, very astute for a young child to understand how the system works in that respect, and also very pragmatic, as in, this is what you can do to change your situation immediately. However, and this is the beauty of the characters, Miss Honey says that she could never do that. Essentially, her love for teaching and nurturing the children's education is to her much more meaningful than just being able to live and having more money. And that reminds us of when Matilda found it far more rewarding to read and explore new universes than sit down in front of telly, which was the Wormwood's approach to entertainment. Finally, what we come to is the notion that it is difficult to fight injustice, especially when you're dealing with certain people of prominence. And Miss Honey describes her aunt as, this aunt of mine is a much respected figure in the community. She has a lot of influence. And of course, that is going to be much more difficult than having an argument with a peer, someone who is seen as an equal in society. Finally, when Miss Trunchbull is named as the aunt, everything falls into place, and it is a great revelation for the reader, and you understand the level of intimidation and terror that Miss Honey must have gone through under her roof, and continues to feel this overpowerment, which Miss Trunchbull is clearly loves inflicting on others. And you, as a reader, you also understand why Miss Honey is so timid and quiet and nervous, given that Miss Trunchbull has this complete control of her on a day-to-day basis. The reader is also infuriated to think that Miss Trunchbull continues to be a respected member of the community despite her actions towards the children within the school and now outside with our beloved Miss Honey as well.